Sociology. Was mache ich damit? Meeting verlassen oder was? Verstanden? Einfach lassen. Das Meeting wird aufgezeichnet. Okay. In German sociology, at any rate, all you hear is a deafening silence on the topic of genocide. And this is especially true when it comes to the genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. German sociology, like Germany as a whole, it seems, urgently needs outside help and enlightenment. How wonderful that tonight help is on its way. Professor Martin Shaw is Professor Emeritus at Sussex University and a senior research professor at the Institut Barcelona Estudis Internacionals. I hope my Catalan was good enough to say that properly. Thank you. Martin Shaw has, of course, widely published and is the author of many books, and I just want to mention a few of them. War and Genocide, Organized Killing in Modern Society from 2003. What is Genocide from 2007, and the second edition was published in 2015. Genocide and International Relations, Changing Patterns in the Transitions of the Late Modern World in 2014. You find all the links to these books, of course, in the Moodle course to the seminar, and you also find some PDFs of Professor Shaw's articles, among them The Genocide That Changed the World and Gaza and the Structure of Genocide in Palestine. And of course, you will also find the link to Martin Shaw's personal website, where you find a lot of extremely interesting and enlightening information from a sociological, intellectual, and political perspectives on all the topics that he has been working on until today. I'd like to add a personal note. In the last century, when searching for basic sociological literature for my Diplomarbeit, something from the last century and millennium, where we didn't have any kind of looking in the net for some publications, you need to go to libraries and check what's going on. I was very pleased to find an extremely interesting article in the British journal Sociology that contributed to a debate on the concept of strategy, which interested me a lot to do my diploma. The title was Strategy and Process, Military Context and Sociological Analysis. This really interesting article was written by a person who was then senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Hull, and his name was Martin Shaw. To come back to this evening, amid the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, Martin Shaw published his latest book last year in 2025, titled The New Age of Genocide, Intellectual and Political Challenges After Gaza. This book serves as the basis of today's lecture, which bears the same title. Professor Shaw, welcome to the University of Potsdam. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm very happy.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mackett, and thank you to you and the University of Potsdam for inviting me here and for hosting this incredibly impressive lecture series. I was saying to Jürgen before we started that I can think of only one other university in the world which has organized a comparable series, and that is Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And I think it's appropriate, but also doubly impressive, that both these lecture series have taken place in the capitals of states which have supported Israel so much in its campaign in Gaza. So I think what we are engaged in, although we're engaged in serious academic activity and discussion, is a challenge in a sense to the consensus which allows this genocide to take place. And from that point of view, I think this is additionally welcome. What I want to do tonight is to talk about the intellectual context in which the Gaza genocide has erupted, and the way in which it has affected how genocide is perceived within the academy and indeed in the wider society and the wider politics. So I'm going to start by situating this genocide in the context of the way in which the genocide field has developed and how it has seen genocide in previous periods. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the Gaza genocide and about the broader context of Palestine and how the genocide questions that arise to do with that. And then I will explain why I think this idea of a new age of genocide is appropriate. And from that, I will take on some of the intellectual issues which have arise from looking at genocide in this context. So I'm going to start with genocide studies, which is a field that I think some of you have begun to study, and a field which took a long time to develop after the idea of genocide was first proposed by Raphael Lemkin in the 1940s, and then within a very few years institutionalized in the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948. So between those developments after the Second World War and the development of genocide studies as an academic field, there were several decades. It was only really in the 1980s that the field began to develop, and it developed very much as the junior sibling of Holocaust studies, because there was huge, and rightly so, huge study of the Holocaust developing in the 60s and the 70s, which inspired people to study other genocides. But the field was very much focused on a small number of genocides that were especially of interest to certain groups within Western societies, and in particular the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, and then later other cases started to be studied. So we had, first of all, the development of genocide studies out of Holocaust studies, and then in this century, something different happened. Jürgen has already indicated that I'm a figure from the last century, and in one sense, I had an academic career before genocide studies, but it was about the beginning of this century that I became into this field. And indeed, it was in the city of Berlin in 2005 that one of the major networks of genocide scholars, what became the International Network of Genocide Scholars, was set up. And this was a conference which brought together scholars, particularly scholars who were interested in the colonial dimensions of genocide and the genocide in a colonial context. So in the 2000s, genocide studies moved into a broader concept of what the field was about, a concept which incorporated the earlier history of Western societies in their interpenetration with the colonial world before the Holocaust, before the class, what we see as the classic genocide of the mid-20th century. So genocide studies broadened and deepened as a result of what we can call the colonial turn. And this was the context in which Palestine was first discussed in genocide studies. In the earlier period, it was more or less completely a no-go to discuss Palestine. Nobody really wanted to talk about the dispossession of the Palestinians within a genocide context, although I shall explain in a little while why I think it was important to do so. But once colonial genocide had begun to be discussed, and especially once settler colonial genocide had begun to be discussed, then it was natural to make the connection, to ask the question, does the dispossession of the Palestinians, like that of other colonial peoples, come within the scope of genocide? Can we use this framework to understand what was happening to the Palestinians? So this was a very important gain, and it's something which only really happened about 20 years ago. For example, with the work of Patrick Wolfe, Australian scholar, who wrote about eliminationism and later about structural genocide in the context of Palestine. But from my point of view, this period, although it was very progressive in this sense, was also a period in which the core debate about the meaning of genocide, which was implicated in the discussion of Palestine, because Palestine was not a case of mass extermination of a people such as happened in the Holocaust. It was a case primarily of mass expulsion, of dispossession in the way that I just mentioned. And so to look at this in this question, in this context, raised questions about the meaning of genocide, about the concept. And yet the field on the whole, I would argue, in the 21st century has been largely agnostic about the question of the meaning of genocide. It has not pursued the debates that happened in the 80s and 90s and right at the beginning of the 2000s about the meaning of genocide, and which left, in my view, the debate in a very unsatisfactory place. Now, my work, as Jürgen has mentioned, included one book which was called "What is Genocide?" And I've tried to, as a sociologist, I have approached the question quite largely from a conceptual point of view. And from my perspective, one of the problems of the field in the first 2 decades of this century really was a turn away from conceptual questions. No, it was partly because there were no really huge genocidal events which, at least from the perspective of most of the people studying the field, seemed to require the field to address the questions anew. In the way that, for example, even Bosnia and Rwanda in the 1990s posed the question. There was, of course, the Darfur genocide, which got a lot of attention, but the conceptual questions were left largely at the side. And this, from my point of view, is a problem. And it is this problem that led us to the situation that we are in today, where the events in Gaza have seen old questions suddenly posed anew in very radical forms. Because what does it mean to say that Gaza is a genocide? That we are now in the situation where very large numbers, just about every major genocide scholar and a substantial number of Holocaust scholars even have acknowledged that what Israel has done in Gaza is a genocide. But what does this mean? What does it, on what basis are we saying that this is a genocide? What is the definition? What is the approach which we are using to come to this conclusion? So I argue that in this decade, there has been a return of the concept of genocide. And I don't just link this to Gaza. Paradoxically, the first sign of this question returning was the book by Dirk Moses, whom many of you may have heard last week in this very lecture theatre, he published this book, The Problems of Genocide, in 2021. And his argument is essentially that genocide has so many problems as a concept that possibly we need to replace it by the idea of permanent security. And this was an argument that I had quite a bit of difficulty with, and I'm going to come back to it later, so I won't say any more at this stage. But this book, a very big, fat, heavy book, and a very solid book based on huge research by one of the most prominent people in the field, put the cat among the pigeons, really, as far as genocide studies were concerned. And it's raised anew the question of whether the whole problematic of genocide was valid. From my perspective, it is, but Dirk raised all sorts of objections to this. The second development was actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, we look at this as a stalemated war, but it was a war that began with the attempt by Vladimir Putin to eliminate not only a separate Ukrainian state, but also a separate Ukrainian society and culture. And in my mind, there was a clear genocidal logic in the Russian approach to Ukraine, and there is a genocidal logic in the Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine to this day. But it is Gaza which has really upended this whole situation. And it has done so really in a triple way. And I've got up here the idea of Gaza bringing to our attention what one of my colleagues, Jonathan Leader-Maynard, has called the triadic nature of the genocide concept. By this he means that genocide is not only illegal and a sociological, but also a political concept. And I think in the case of Gaza, we see these dimensions coming together. They don't always easily relate to each other, but in the question of genocide in Gaza, we have now very strong legal arguments from scholars, from humanitarian organizations, from lawyers. We have the sort of sociological arguments that I'm going to develop in this lecture, and we also, of course, have the political arguments of those people in countries around the world who have protested against the Gaza genocide and have focused on the idea of genocide as the prime way of capturing and opposing the terribly violent, destructive logic of Israel's policies. So this tiny strip of land, that's why I have this up here, this tiny and shrinking strip of land, because you can see that's the map of Gaza today, or that's the map of Gaza as it was a few months ago, when Israel had taken the eastern part of Gaza, leaving only the west for the Palestinians to live in. Already it has shrunk still further. Israel has taken still more. This tiny strip of land, with a population of little over 2 million people, so much less than that of Berlin, has been the focus of this huge upheaval in global politics and global thought that I'm talking about today. Now, I'm going to talk about Gaza not simply as something which suddenly developed in 2023, but as the culmination of processes in Palestine which we can talk of in a genocidal framework. As I was saying, 20 years ago, Patrick Wolf and I and then other scholars began to talk about the question of genocide in Palestine long before the recent events in Gaza. And I want to put this into some perspective here, drawing on the framework which I develop in a more complex way in my book, Genocide and International Relations, which the cover of which is up there. I want to suggest that there have been really three broad patterns of genocide in modern history. The colonial pattern, which scholars have been analyzing, especially in the last 20 years or so. The classical pattern of European genocide, centered on the Holocaust, but in the view of most scholars, much broader than the Holocaust. The Nazis were not the only people who committed genocide in Europe in the middle 20th century. And then what very broadly we can call post-colonial genocide, the genocide which has developed in many places in the post-colonial world in the last 3/4 of a century. I'm not going to try and justify these frameworks now, but simply to say these are different patterns. To some extent, they overlap in time. That's why I call them patterns, but also to some extent, they are historical periods. They map onto historical periods. Colonial genocide in the period from the 16th to the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. European genocide primarily in the first half of the 20th century, and post-colonial genocide more recently. Now, what I want to suggest that Israel, we can connect the Israeli case to these patterns in different ways. And I'll explain how this relates to Palestine in more detail in a moment. First of all, it is Israel is a result of a settler colonial movement. The Zionist movement was in its origins an explicitly settler colonial movement. The Israeli state today is still promoting settler colonization in the parts of Palestine that nominally remain, in some sense, Palestinian. Secondly, though, it is also the product of an exclusive nationalism, which comes from Europe, especially from Central and Eastern Europe, in the period of other exclusive nationalisms which produced genocide in Europe in the middle 20th century. So Zionism was a nationalist movement, a Jewish nationalist movement, which developed at the end of the 19th century and through the first half of the 20th century, and which focused on this project of colonization. And this makes this case of settler colonialism very different from most other cases. There are other cases in which people who were persecuted and who were members of minorities in Western and European countries went to other parts of the world and colonized and could be arguably involved in colonial genocide. But the Zionist movement was a nationalist movement, and the movement of people who were a minority in Europe, a very persecuted minority, and they took their project for their sort of emancipation to Palestine and attempted to form a state there and succeeded in forming a state there. So this makes them very different, even before we bring into the equation the question of the Holocaust. So the Jews who were the victims of the largest, the emblematic genocide of the 20th century, go to Palestine and are involved in the oppression of the Palestinians and the expropriation of the Palestinians, issues which raise questions of genocide. So this is a very distinctive case. Thirdly, I think we can connect Israel to the question of post-coloniality, and especially to decolonization. Israel is the result of a process of competitive decolonization, a process in which the Zionist movement, the Jewish nationalist movement, competed with the Palestinian national movement to take over Palestine when the British Mandate, the sort of colonial arrangement, ended in the late 1940s. And this again makes it rather different. So when we talk about settler colonialism in Australia or in North America in the 18th and 19th centuries, well, the beginning of the 20th century, we're talking about something different from a settler colonial movement, which comes to the peak of its power in the middle of the 20th century, at the moment when elsewhere in the world, decolonization is taking place, and which competes with the indigenous national movement to take over. And there were other cases of this, of course: Algeria, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, South Africa. But in all these other cases, the settler colonial movement did not succeed in taking over in the end. Or in South Africa, it was in power, but it eventually gave it up. So all these aspects mean that Israel is both typical, or is both implicated in the general patterns that we can see in modern genocide, but also in a very particular way, in a different way from virtually every other case. Genocidal situations do not fit a simple textbook pattern. They are historically unique situations, and this is one of them. Now, I have put in the corner of this slide Omer Bartov's recent book, Israel, What Went Wrong? And I'm not going to go into detail about why I disagree with Bartov, but the question I think we need to ask is, did it go wrong? Or was it because Zionism from the beginning had the idea of removing Palestinians in order to create room for a Jewish state? Was it, in a sense, flawed from the beginning? So, looking at Palestine, before the events in Gaza of the last 2.5 years, this crisis, which was emblematic of the fate of the Palestinians, was, of course, the Nakba, the great catastrophe of 1947-48, when the majority of Palestinians at the time were expelled or fled and then not allowed to return by Israel to their homes and to the areas in which they had lived for centuries. So we have this idea of the Nakba as a historic event, as a one moment in the history of the Palestinians and in the history of modern Israel, and of course the moment of the creation of modern Israel, because Israel was created through this dispossession, through this catastrophe. The catastrophe of the Palestinians was the war of independence of the Zionist movement. So these events of 1947-48 are seen sometimes as you know, a unique moment, as a moment of particular intensity in the process of destruction. But they are only a moment in a longer process. And we have to ask the questions about the way in which the original project of the Zionist movement to create a Jewish state in a Palestinian land raised the danger of genocide in the way that other settler colonial projects did elsewhere. We have to particularly ask whether the Zionist idea of transferring the Palestinians out of Palestine into other territories, a euphemistic idea of removing a people in order to create room for another people, whether this was a genocidal idea. I argue that it was, because I argue that the removal of a population, the mass uprooting of a whole people, is the destruction of a society. There was a Palestinian society in large parts of Palestine in 1947, which no longer existed in 1949, and which does not exist today. And over the ruins of it have been built much of modern Israel. But Palestinian scholars and indeed advocates say that the Nakba was not simply these events of those years. The Nakba was a long process, a structure, not an event, as the Palestinian scholar Ari Imsais says. The destruction of the Palestinian society had begun before 1947, and it continued after. And indeed, 1947 wasn't the only mass expulsion event. There was also in 1967 the removal of another 300,000 Palestinians from large areas in which Israel conquered in that year. And of course, the creation of the occupation. And the occupation is really the context, or the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is really the context in which the question of genocide is most seriously posed after 1948. The occupation should bring to mind, for genocide scholars, Lemkin's original work in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which was the book which introduced the concept of genocide, which was, as the title suggests, a book about how occupation was a genocidal form of domination and rule. But to a large extent, these questions have not been asked. I think they should be. I think that if we look at the dispossession of the Palestinians, which has been going on consistently through the occupation over the last nearly 6 decades, we should be asking questions about how this continues, the mass dispossession of the Nakba and of 1967. Now, Gaza plays a particular role in this. Gaza was where many of the people who were dispossessed in 1947 and 48 were forced to go, where they fled to, where they eventually became concentrated. The Gaza Strip, as it now exists, was created through the Nakba, the concentration of Palestinians in a very small part of the historic southern part of Palestine. Gaza in recent decades, especially in the last 20 years or 17, 18 years, has seen particular processes which we can see as proto-genocidal, the collective punishment of Gaza during these years of Israeli blockade saw Israel pioneering some of the methods which have been used in the last 2 years. We all know about how Israel has tried to block the supply of food into Gaza since October 2023 and is still doing it today. What I don't think many people do know is that this was already a part of Israeli policy during the period of the blockade, to put the Palestinians on a diet, as Israeli policymakers talked about it, not to starve them completely, but to put them on a diet, to constrain their food supply. So what is happening today is the culmination of processes which began before. Another aspect of the collective punishment was the idea of mowing the grass. Now, if any of you have read Zygmunt Bauman's book, Modernity and the Holocaust, you'll know that he talks about gardening as a metaphor of genocide. Well, mowing the grass is an Israeli metaphor for the use of extreme brutality, massacres of hundreds, even in some cases thousands of civilians, as a method of keeping control over Gaza. And although in the years before 2023, this did not reach the level of total mass attack on the whole of Gazan society, these massacres that were taking place in the wars that went on from 2008 up to 2021, before the events of 2023, these already, I think, pose the question of genocide in Gaza. Not in the sense of an overall genocide, but in the sense of limited genocidal massacre. This idea of genocidal massacre is an idea which is there in the literature. You'll find it in the work of Leo Cooper, for example, leading anthropologist of genocide. And it is, I think, a very important concept. And it's relevant also to 2023 and 7/10, 7th October 2023, which, for my money, and I go out on a limb here a bit, was also a genocidal massacre, to the extent that Hamas deliberately intended the massacre of Israeli civilians, as well as the taking hostage of large numbers of Israeli civilians. And I think that the genocidal character of that attack, although it was limited, it was small scale compared to what came after, it was something that took place within a day or two in that month of October 2023. I think this helps to explain what came after. Because we know from the study of colonial genocide that when the colonized attack the colonial population, especially when they attack the civilians of the colonial population, the colonizers usually respond with terrible force. Here in Germany, you're familiar, I think, with the Namibian genocide at the beginning of the 20th century, or in German Southwest Africa, where the Herero people attacked the German colonizers, and the German army responded with a ferocious total genocide of the Herero and Nama people, which went on in the following years. Well, I think what we have been seeing in Gaza is something like that, and it bears the same sort of relationship, despite the difference in time and context. But Gaza is very much a 21st century version of that kind of genocide. It's a very unique event, partly because of the specific geopolitical context in which it has taken place. I mean, the Namibian genocide was still in the period of high imperialism and colonialism. the Gaza genocide is in the period in which world media report instantly on what is happening in different parts of the world, in which liberal values are supposedly institutionalized at the global level, in which colonialism is supposed to be a thing of the past, in which genocide is outlawed. So, in all these ways, it's different. But it's also different, I think, if we think about the technology which is available and which Israel has used to destroy Gaza. So I think you've also had Eyal Weizman here to talk, haven't you? I mean, his idea of the ungrounding of Gaza, the way in which Israel has not only destroyed the built environment, but has reduced it to nothing, so that we can no longer even see the traces of where the cities were, where the streets were. The way the bulldozer has become as much an emblem of the Israeli genocide as the F-35 bombers, which have been used to pound Palestinian targets. The very distinctive kind of genocide, and very much bound up with the fact that Israel has been confined largely to this very small territory. It's been able to exert this sort of total control. The population has been removed within the territory, but it hasn't been expelled. I've got at the bottom there, unrealized goals. Israel has not yet been able to expel the population. It dreams of doing that. It dreams of replacing the Palestinian society, which has largely been destroyed, with a new sort of Israeli-American corporate reality, but it hasn't yet been able to do that. Now, the other thing I think is that when we think about the motives of the Israeli genocide, one motive is clearly revenge. And clearly at the beginning, this was a very powerful motive for the Israeli elite and indeed for Israeli society, revenge for October the 7th. But underlying that, of course, is this project of elimination, which has been going on for a century. And alongside that are all these fantastical security concerns, the idea of somehow totally eliminating the threat from Hamas or from Palestinian organizations, which underlies a lot of Israeli thinking. And this is something we'll come back to, because of course permanent security is the big idea which Dirk Moses has introduced into the genocide field. Now, I want to come back to Lemkin. I mentioned his book. I've got the cover of his book up on the screen there. And I want to draw attention to what he said about the two phases of genocide. I don't know if you can read that, I think, can you? He said there were two phases of genocide. The first, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. So in Gaza, the destruction of Palestinian society. The second, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. And then he said, key phrasing which hasn't been sufficiently given weight in the genocide field, this imposition in turn may be made upon the oppressed population which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after removal of the population and colonization by the oppressor's own nationals. Now, this is important because the second part of that, the second option there that Lemkin outlines, is what Israel would like to do but hasn't been able to do. Lemkin clearly indicates this as one of the key options of genocide. It's interesting, actually, that he has these two options. He doesn't have extermination. He doesn't have the total mass murder of the population as one of the key methods of genocide. He did recognize that that was one of the ways in which genocide was carried out. Of course he did, because he was writing at the time when the mass murder of the Jews was taking place, and he knew enough about it to very much recognize it. But he didn't see this as one of the key methods of genocide. So that's one of the things we need to bear in mind, this question of expulsion, of removal as a method of genocide. But I want to focus on something else. What does it mean to impose genocide on a population which remains in place? I mean, Lemkin says allowed to remain. I think in the case of Gaza, it's more the case of the fact that Israel has not been able to find a way of removing it because other states have blocked that. And Lemkin has an answer in his book. He says, that is the attempt to cripple a society as well as the individual members of it. And he uses other words like weaken, disintegrate, degrade. Genocide, he wrote after 1944, he wrote in a couple of years later, is the criminal intent to destroy or cripple permanently a human group. And this idea is reflected in the inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group, which is in the Genocide Convention, one of the methods that was included in the convention, and the method which many people have seen as most pertinent to Gaza. Now, this crippling idea, I think, is very relevant to Gaza. So there's what Lemkin said, one of his many statements, but a statement which brings together the fact that he saw the daily fight literally for bread, which was the sort of thing we saw when Israel was in its Gaza Humanitarian Foundation phase, you know, when the American firm was in providing aid, and Israel was shooting down the Palestinians who were trying to get the limited aid that was being provided. He links that with the problem of physical survival with the way in which thinking in general and national terms is handicapped. So he's linking the physical suffering and the inflicted on the population, on individuals and families, with the destruction of the national potential of that population. Look at what Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist who writes for Haaretz, said 3 weeks ago about where Israel is at in Gaza today. And you see, really, he's using the same language that Lemkin used in 1944, making the entire population permanently disabled, injured, sick, hungry, homeless, unemployed, reducing them to a disparate mass without an organized society, causing the complete disintegration of the social fabric. This could be taken from Axis rule in occupied Europe. This is what Lemkin was thinking about. Now, I'm going to come back to this idea of crippling because it's a very important idea. But before we do that, I just want to say very briefly something about this genocide being a Western genocide, a genocide in Western power as a whole, and particularly American power, has been fundamentally implicated. So we have Western and European participation in this, American and European participation in this genocide, not just providing the weapons, which the United States and Germany especially have done, or providing military support, which the United Kingdom has done, but participating, as Trump's America has done, in deciding the fate of Gaza, and which all the other Western countries, more or less, apart from Spain maybe, have gone along with. And this all based on the political, economic, technological integration of Israel with the West, and especially the ideological integration, the way in which Holocaust commemoration and anti-Semitism have been made fundamental to the ideological frameworks of Western countries. And the whole structure of denial of the genocide which has been built around that. I've got here the book by Stanley Cohen, a sociologist whom I was privileged to work with many decades ago, who went to Israel. He was Jewish, South African, and originally a Zionist, and he went to Israel to study, and he studied the condition of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention and prisons. And he came back to the United Kingdom where he was living beforehand, and he wrote this book, States of Denial, about the different kinds of denial that can take place. And he says that in addition to literal denial, saying that Israel isn't killing people, or it hasn't killed as many people as we know it has, there is also interpretive denial, denial that says, oh, well, it may be killing people, but it's only because Hamas has got people in tunnels. Or it may be killing people, it may be committing maybe a few war crimes, but it isn't committing genocide. It isn't committing crimes against humanity. And he also says there's a problem of implicatory denial, where you say, yeah, maybe Israel is committing genocide, as quite a lot now of the liberal West has said, or liberal Western thinkers and publications have said, but without following through on the implications that should follow from that. If a state is committing genocide, normally we would think then there would be deep sanctions on that state. It would no longer be regarded as an ally. But we find a lot of people saying, yes, it may be a genocide, but we shouldn't follow through in that way. And we see, of course, the repressive institutionalization of this denial in the way in which Palestinian voices have been silenced and marginalized, and the fact that very few universities have lecture series like this. So, the new age of genocide. Why is this the new age of genocide? Before Gaza, the dominant way of thinking about Western relationship to genocide was what I'm calling here the Samantha Power syndrome. Samantha Power wrote a book called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, published in 2003. And in relation to what I'm calling post-colonial genocide, she said, the Western problem is a failure to prevent. The West is not systematically upholding the norms of genocide prevention that are in the convention, and it is allowing genocide to take place. And she said, this is not an accident. This is not simply a failure. It's a success of a policy of non-intervention. So the lessons from this, more intervention, more use of international law, responsibility to protect. When we look at Gaza, I think we could see that this paradigm has broken down. We have internationalized direct participation by Western countries in the genocide. We have an ultra-modern genocide, which uses AI as well as F-35s. We have a genocidal mentality, which infects the leaders of the United States, especially, as well as of authoritarian countries like Russia. We have attacks on international law. The United States and Israel trying to fundamentally undermine, effectively to destroy, the International Criminal Court. We have, I would say, the end of prevention. There is no serious genocide prevention enterprise anymore. We have, at the same time, though, of course, a global anti-genocide movement, which we didn't have in the earlier period. So this is, in a nutshell, my New Age argument. I was going to talk a bit about the legal framework, but I think given the time, I'm going to move on a bit. And just to say, really, basically, I think the legal framework is important, the Genocide Convention, but you can see my image is rather blurry, and that says something, actually, because the meaning of the law of genocide is also rather blurry. It's fine in principle. It would enable us to, it enables us, I think, to prosecute Israel, as South Africa is trying to do. It would enable the ICC to bring genocide charges against Netanyahu, but at the same time, it has all sorts of problems. And many of these are very well known. Because of time, I'm not going to the detail about them, but these are problems which have been identified mostly in the genocide literature, and which, if you studied it, you probably have already come across. Now, I said I would come back to Dirk Mersey's argument, because in this book, The Problems of Genocide, which he published 5 years ago, so just before Gaza, really, he argued really that the concept was not fit for purpose. He argued that it necessarily excluded, or it had been constructed. It had been constructed, especially by the drafters of the Genocide Convention, so as to exclude military violence and therefore the violence of liberal states. He argued that it depoliticized violence, that genocide rather. It depoliticized violence. It turned the violence of states into hate crimes in the way that the Holocaust was understood against a hate crime against the Jew, and ruled out really the politics behind the commission of mass atrocities. He argued that it privileged racialized destruction of a group over the military destruction of a group. So in particular, he said that it means that the destruction of a people is more important than the destruction of people, full stop. You know, so it privileges, he argues, the group element. And he argued, contrary really to what I've been saying so far about Lemkin's idea of crippling, he argued that Lemkin's idea of crippling, incorporation of the crippling idea in the genocide concept, was a political device. He said, this is true so far as it goes. Lemkin was very much a political activist. He was trying to get the Genocide Convention adopted. And certainly when Lemkin put together the idea of genocide in 1944, he wanted to link the destruction of the Jews and the crippling of the European peoples that was going on. And this served a political purpose. So Dirk is right about that so far as it goes. But Dirk says then that this made genocide an unstable concept because it was too broad. It included things which were, to some extent, different from each other, types of violence that were different from each other. And worse than that, from my point of view, he says, in places, he says it's an inherently unstable concept. So not only was it unstable in the thinking of Lemkin and later the convention, but it could not be made more coherent and stable. And he proposed the idea of permanent security, the idea that states seek to preempt security threats. So, for example, in Gaza, Israeli leaders say, you know, even the children have to be destroyed because they will be the threat in the future. That is an example of what Dirk means by permanent security. So he said this would be the alternative concept. I will note in passing that in his lecture last week, and also in some of the things he's written more recently, he's, I think, shifted his position a bit. He says that Gaza has involved a repoliticization of the genocide idea. But I'm going to take the book as it stands. Now, I have a critique of him. First of all, I think he simplifies the law. He says that it means, this is a quote from his lecture last week, actually, if something is a war, it can't be a genocide. And this really bypasses the central discussion which has been taking place over the last 2 or 3 years. And you'll find it in, for example, in the Amnesty International report on why Israel is committing genocide in Gaza in significant detail, about how, even within the existing framework of international law, Israel could be simultaneously committing military violence against Hamas and also genocidal violence against the Palestinian people. So it's a crucial point which lawyers certainly haven't given up on, and I don't think we should give up on, because I think it's a reasonable interpretation of the convention to say that is what it means. I think he overstates the depoliticization, and I think this recent acknowledgement of repoliticization is an example of that. I think genocide doesn't have to be depoliticized, even in the way it's presented in the convention. And I think he minimizes the distinctiveness of racialized targeting. See, he says it's important that the destruction of people should be regarded as important as the destruction of peoples or of a people. And that's true so far as it goes. I can agree with that. But I think there still can be different things. I think when Israel attacks Iran and it destroys Iranian military bunkers and it kills civilians like 150 school children in Minab, it is committing terrible atrocities. Or in fact, in that case, sorry, it was the Americans, wasn't it? I mustn't blame Israel for things that the Americans have done. But that is a war that involves considerable departure from legal norms. It's a legal war. It's carried out by methods that disregard the protections for civilians. It is very problematic, but it is not the same as the sort of policy that Israel is pursuing in Gaza, where there is a systematic ideological thrust to destroy the Palestinians as a group. Israel and the United States, even less, don't want to destroy Iranians as a group, the Iranian population as a group, as an Iranian society, as a viable enterprise. They do want to do that to the Palestinians in Gaza. So I think the racialization of groups and the targeting of groups, the situation in which a civilian population is seen as an enemy to be destroyed, is different from even the most degenerate war. And we need to look at these as twin aspects of current Israeli and other states' policies. And I think the argument also minimized the possibility of recognizing liberal genocide in the way that I have just done. I don't think that genocide is only a problematic that can be applied to authoritarian states, as a lot of people assume. I think that's conceding too much. I think the last 2 or 3 years have shown that it is very, very credible to apply it to a state which, on the surface, appears to be a liberal Western democracy. With all the caveats we can introduce into that, it certainly has elements of those institutions. And I would finally say that the Lemkin's combination of crippling and extermination is coherent. The extermination of the Jews during the Second World War was part of the overall assault on societies, the whole population, especially in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the former Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia, places like that. These two things went together. And the Nazis had an overall racial schema. So I think they go together as in history, and I think they go together today. Now, I was going to go into, but I think maybe in the interest of time, I will leave aside some of the issues about the methodology involved here. But I'll make this, the slides are available, and you can look at it. I think the conceptual history is incomplete, because the argument that genocide is inherently unstable as a concept doesn't take into account the efforts that some people have made to make it more coherent and stable. And I think that Dirk, as a historian, a conceptual historian, nevertheless substitutes a conceptual history for a proper analysis of what the concepts mean. And my core argument here is that there is a distinction between, and I draw on Weber. This is the bit I think I'm going to draw over, and you're going to have to study at your own leisure. There's a distinction between concepts and judgments. This is Weber's way of phrasing it in the English translation. A concept is something which names a phenomenon. A judgment is his way of expressing how, the idea of explanation, of understanding. And I think that genocide is a concept which names certain type of violence within the overall perspective on war and genocide. And permanent security, which Dirk has proposed as an alternative concept isn't really an alternative. It can be complementary because it is more an explanation. It is one of the explanations, for example, for what is happening in Gaza. It's part of the explanation. It's an important part of the explanation, but it doesn't substitute for the genocide concept. And this maybe also is something I'm going to have to leave with you, but you can ask me about it. This is based on my approach also wants to bring together war and genocide, but I wanted to bring them together in a way that recognizes the distinctiveness of the two ideas and recognizes that as well as the ideal type of war as a conflict between states and armies, and genocide as an attack by armed force on the civilian population, we have also the murky reality of most war today as something which is neither one nor the other, which is what I call degenerate war, in which states target civilians as means of defeating armed enemies. And these are concepts which we can apply to action within wars. It's a complicated business. We have to say, is this a war? Is this a genocide? But we also have to say within something we might overall call a war, there is genocide. Within a genocide, there may also be elements of military conflict, and these concepts can be used together. And this is something I outlined in my my first book, War and Genocide. It's the framework you'll find there, but I elaborate in my What is Genocide? And what I argue there is that contrary to what Dirk says about genocide being an unstable concept, I think war is an unstable concept. If war is only legitimate when it is between armed forces and between states, yet most war actually leads to the destruction of civilian populations one way or another, then what is left of the idea of war as a legitimate social activity? So I argue that this concept is more unstable, in fact, than the concept of genocide. So conclusions. I think genocide is an essential concept. It's necessary. I think that the last 2.5 years have shown that it's necessary. It's the only way that we have to understand what Israel has done to the Palestinians of Gaza as a whole. We can say, yes, they've committed loads of war crimes. We can say, as the ICC has charged Netanyahu, they have committed the crimes of humanity, of persecution, of unlawful killing, and so on, of starvation. But what is it they're trying to do as a whole? They are trying to destroy Palestinian society in Gaza. And that is what genocide is about. That was the original concept of genocide that Lemkin developed, and that is what applies. And we need, the genocide field really needs to get off its conceptual fence and to try to develop this concept more coherently, not avoid these sort of conceptual issues. But it needs to do this in a war and genocide framework, recognizing the importance of security drivers. It's also, I think, the last 2.5 years have shown us that the international law of genocide is reaching a moment of truth. With the cases that South Africa brought and the cases which the ICC have brought, although those are not yet of genocide, we have really a moment of truth in which we need to see if international law is capable of applying systematically the crime of genocide. And we will see it maybe in the Myanmar case, which is underway, being adjudicated at the moment. But we will see it, I think, most definitively when the South Africa case against Israel comes to conclusion. And finally, I would say that, and here I'm going to end. I've spent a little bit of time there criticizing Dirk Moses' approach in his 2021 book. I'd like to agree, though, with one of the things he said to you last week. One of the most striking things, and I thought also a bit of a departure from his previous emphasis. He said that the protesters against what Israel have done have expressed the conceptual truth of the genocide idea. And I think that is also something that we need to acknowledge, that it is very, very important that this idea of genocide has been taken up by the millions, indeed the tens and hundreds of millions of people across the world who have embraced it. That the understanding that Israel has committed genocide has percolated into the corners of British, German, French, even American society, where polls show that very large numbers of people believe that Israel has committed genocide. So this is an idea whose time has come, and I think the protesters in particular have made it so. So I'd like to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this interesting, very sociological and intellectual contribution to the discussions we had already here and your own ideas. I think we can start with questions, and I try to do my best with a microphone.